Yellow and Red Makes by Digits 27, Chapter 24. The bleak dirt path seemed to stretch on forever, endlessly winding in between the trees like a drunken snake. The five of them trudged along, all of them far too weary and the weather too dreary for them to attempt conversation. Gerard took the lead, walking purposely like he actually knew where they were going, which of course wasn't true. The three Chenin walked side by side, a few paces behind him, increasingly distressed by the endless path. Anko brought up the rear, equally irritated and annoyed as Naruto, Gaara, and Tayuya, but the difference was she was more vocal. "Come on, Jiraiya, when the hell are we going to get there?" The white-haired man in question's eyed twitched as the tick that had been steadily growing since their departure gained a friend. "Quiet down, Anko. You're worse than the Gaki here." Everyone else in the group would have taken offense at that had they not been far too tired to care either way. Anko was about to retort in her usual manner, but they were saved from Jiraiya exploding as they rounded the corner of the paths and the trees finally broke. They rounded the crest of a hill and stared down at the sprawling mini metropolis below them. This is Tanzaku Town. Anko looked down at it in wonder. There were so many people going about in the full throes of some festivals or another. As far as she knew, there was always something to celebrate in this town. It was what made it such a tourist hotspot. Jiraiya turned around to face the group, particularly Naruto. Now you're sure Tsunade will be here?" Naruto just scoffed, looking insulted. "Of course she will be. They're celebrating the Kishihototsu festival here. That's the biggest gambling event of the season in this part of the country. I bet she couldn't avoid this place if she wanted to." Jiraiya sighed. He knew Naruto had a point, but he hated being reminded of it. He was the one who was supposed to have the inscrutable spy network, not the little blonde Gaki here. Fine. Let's just go get some rooms booked, and we can start searching tomorrow." Everyone in the group nodded enthusiastically. They were tired of walking and wanted to get off their feet. "Hey, Jiraiya, wait up!" Naruto ran after the large Sannin, who paused to allow him to catch up. "What is it, Naruto?" The blonde boy ran over, still not winded despite having run clear across the village in search of the legendary pervert. "So if all the stuff about the Katsuki is true," Jiraiya looked offended, like his intelligence could ever be wrong, then what are we going to do about it?" Jiraiya stared at the young boy, wondering just how much he could tell him. It was true he hadn't been there for his childhood throughout most of his life, but he at least appeared to be relatively perceptive and somewhat level-headed. "We're not going to do anything." He had stressed the word "we're," and Naruto stared at him confused until he clarified, "I'm going to find Tsunade and try to convince her to take the position of Hokage." Naruto nodded slowly, seeing the logic in finding a strong leader for the village in a time of crisis. If what Jiraiya said about the Katsuki was true, then this was definitely a time of crisis. What worried Naruto the most was that if they were collecting the Biju, then it wasn't only Naruto who was in danger, but Gaara as well. "Alright then, I can help you with that." Jiraiya looked at him strangely, eyebrow quirked and an amused smile on his face. "And how exactly do you think you can help me?" It was Naruto's turn to smirk as he confidently looked out at the horizon in the distance. "Because I know where Tsunade will be." Naruto relaxed in the chair, taking in the plethora of food laid out in front of them by the very kind and polite staff of the hotel. He happily dug into the assortment of sashimi while his friends and sensei did the same. Jiraiya didn't eat surprisingly. Instead, he was off talking to somebody Naruto would have guessed was a contact in his spy network. No doubt the man was currently scouring the small city in an attempt to find his old teammate. In fact, he was only doing such because Anko had forcefully stopped him from running off to the various brothels in the town 3 times. Having her along was the best thing to happen because she detested perverts all of all kinds. It was a thought Naruto now found particularly hilarious considering who the author of the book she now happily read was. Jiraiya finally entered the room, sitting down with a very frustrated look, which Naruto took to mean the search had been unsuccessful so far. He seemed to shake it off and turned happily to Naruto with a mischievous glint in his eye. "Well, Naruto, I came to a decision that since you are out here with me, I might as well train you a little." Jiraiya didn't get the reaction he had been expecting with that statement. Anko shot him a death glare, like he was insinuating that she was incapable of teaching Naruto, while Tayuya was doing likewise, wondering why the hell Naruto was getting special training. Jiraiya gulped loudly from the combined attack from the 2 angered females. Now, Anko, I didn't mean to imply you aren't a good teacher. It would simply be a technique that you don't know." Anko still seemed annoyed, but was now at least curious as to what Jiraiya would teach Naruto. "And Tayuya, don't worry about it. You could attempt it as well." Again, the younger girl still seemed irritated but at least somewhat sated. Jiraiya was more curious as to why he had no reaction from the two boys yet. So what would you teach me? It was said plainly, only the faintest hints of intrigue that made Jiraiya want to cry. He was a Sanin, actually offering training to somebody, and they were only slightly curious. Jiraiya, on the other hand, didn't even look like he was paying attention anymore, more focused on the food in front of him than the pervert at the head of the table. Jiraiya tried to ignore him and turned back to Naruto, turning on his salesman voice to further interest the kid. How about the move I used on Kisame when I rescued you two? He added a small eyebrow wiggle to complete the enticement, but Naruto smirked at him calmly and stood up from the table and clutched his right wrist with his left hand. Quickly, and much to Jiraiya's astonishment, blue energy began to form in the palm of Naruto's hand, rapidly coalescing into a large sphere. Jiraiya just stood watching the spinning orb of chakra, transfixed by the size before Naruto dispelled it harmlessly. You mean that one? The three of them hopped through the trees. It had taken them a long slog through the desert, but they were finally in river country and on schedule. None of them wanted anything to go wrong with their first unsupervised speed raid mission, so they had to cut off the unusual antics that Baki would have kept to a minimum. Even so, Naruto wasn't really paying attention to the branches ahead of them, more focused on the kunai in his hand. Taiya looked across at him in annoyance. Naruto hadn't dropped that kunai since they had left the village. Normally, that wouldn't have annoyed her. It paid to be safe, but he wasn't even using it for its proper purpose. When he had told her he was going to investigate his own chakra control exercise, she had actually laughed in his face. It just sounded that hilarious. Even so, here he was, running along while perfectly balancing the kunai point between the palm of his hand. From what Tayuya understood in the mumbled and nearly incoherent description Naruto had given, the object was to focus chakra in streams from the Tenketsu in your hand. Then using those streams of chakra like tethers, you would hold up the kunai. It sounded simple enough, but the concentration and sheer volume of chakra required made it completely useless for anyone except chakra powerhouses like Naruto. She stopped focusing on him and instead thought about the mission at hand, a simple retrieval mission. Normally that wouldn't warrant a B rank, except what they were retrieving was money, and the person they were retrieving it was from Tsunade of the Sanin. She had run out on a gambling debt, a very large one if the client's anger was anything to go on, and apparently that warrant the hiring of ninja to track her down and retrieve it. Honestly, the girl thought it was a major waste of her time and skills, but at least she would be able to meet Tsunade. The woman was like an icon to many kunoichi across the elemental nations, supposedly one of the most powerful shinobi in the world. Taiya would hardly describe her as a fangirl or a sycophant of any kind, but she didn't turn down opportunities when they presented themselves. Meeting Tsunade definitely counted as an opportunity in her book, a great one too. Naruto, would you quit playing with that stupid kunai? Naruto just waved at her offhandedly, making Taiya scowl. Wait, I think I almost have it. Taiya was about to come over and beat him a little for waving her off, but watching in amazement as Naruto put too much chakra into his exercise and the kunai flew out of his hand, embedding itself into a tree not far away. That wasn't what interested her. What was more fascinating was the slight swirl of chakra that was left in Naruto's hand. He didn't even seem to realize it was there until he looked down and yelped in surprise. He flapped his arm and the chakra dispelled instantly. Wait, shithead! Do that again! Naruto looked at her strangely, but pulled out another kunai, performing the exact same procedure, ending up with another kunai drilled into a tree. All three of them watched the maze as swirling chakra once again was left in Naruto's hand, before slowly disappearing as the energies were released. That was fucking awesome! How did you do that? Naruto just shrugged, looking at his hand in amazement. The rest of the trip to the town Tsunade was last spotted in went fairly quickly. Naruto continued with his newfound skill, finding that he didn't need a kunai to make the chakra appear. Now he would just hold out his hand, and after a moment of concentration, swirling chakra appeared. They were all astounded by the new technique Naruto had seemingly created. They had no idea what it could be used for, but that was what experimentation was for. They reached the town with Naruto still playing with the swirling blue chakra and quickly scouted out the nearest taverns and gambling halls, which was where they were told they would find the youthful-looking Sanin. And this was also one of the reasons Taiya wanted to find Tsunade. Her healing skills were legendary, and she had supposedly found a way to make herself appear youthful well into her 50s. What woman didn't want that? They kept asking around town and eventually struck lucky as somebody recognized seeing the woman they were after at a pub not far from them. They ran at the location, entering nonchalantly to not arouse suspicion. They received a few odd looks from the patrons because of their age, but when they saw the headbands, they lost interest. That was an unspoken rule regarding shinobi, best expressed as old enough to kill, old enough to drink. Many barmen went along with this because it merely added to their potential clientele, and that meant more money for them. They found a booth quickly and scooted out the small tavern. It didn't take long to find the agent stunning. They tended to change. They tended to change her appearance. She tended to change her appearance often to fool people like them, trying to find her after running out on a debt. But there were clues, two very large clues. Naruto's mouth hung open a little as he stared at the woman, only snapping out of it when he remembered she was about 5 times his age. Of course, Taya slapped him on the back of his head had nothing to do with it. They discussed how to approach the situation. The woman was legendary for a few reasons, and her strength was one of them. She also seemed to be accompanied by a young girl, probably about 18, which might pose a problem if she decided to run interference, giving Tsunade time to escape. In the end, they decided to wait. The woman seemed to be drinking herself into a stupor, and they would allow it. Then they would approach directly, letting Gaara do the talking, and he was the most sensible of the three. Finally, they agreed that Tsunade was drunk enough and they walked over. Immediately, the girl next to her became defensive seeing Gaara's headband, but Naruto put his hands up showing they meant no harm. The girl was still tense, but she allowed them to sit down. Everything eyeing them warningly. Gaara sat down in the middle of the booth so he could talk with Naruto and Taiya. While they sat on either side. Naruto in the corner so he could continue to play with his new ability. Please don't feel alarmed by our presence. We are merely here to collect the money you owe. After that, we will go and leave you in peace, as there is no need for conflict. The very drunk and sleepy Tsunade on the other side of the booth let out a loud and amused snort. Ha! Little brats think they actually stand a chance against me. Naruto had to hold back a snicker. From the way the woman talked, she was obviously absolutely hammered. It did put them on guard, however. Many shinobi feigned more being drunk than they actually were to catch their enemies off guard. What makes you think I just would out of here and there isn't a damn thing you could do me? Naruto tuned out the conversation at this point. He could just let Naruto deal with it as they planned. He continued to play with the chakra in his hands, marveling for a moment as he got it to spin wildly for a few seconds, wondering if he could do something with that. So now they caught the action. Even in her hasty state, she saw what looked a lot like her teammate's attack in one of the kid's hands. Ha! Well, would you look at that? The brat thinks she can do the Rasengan. Naruto looked up, seeing that she was talking about him, and suddenly gained interest in the conversation. His teammates and the girl to Tsunade's side also looked over to him in interest. Tsunade sneered a little, looking slightly to Naruto's left as she swayed for a moment. Like a little brat like you could ever hope to learn the fourth Hokage's technique. Now Naruto was very interested. What are you talking about? Tsunade swayed a bit more, her eyes not quite focusing in the same place before turning back to Naruto. He might have been imagining it, but her action seemed very more pronounced and exaggerated, like she was in fact faking. Unbeknownst to him, Tsunade had actually been using her medical training to quickly burn off the excess alcohol in her system since the moment they sat down. Unfortunately for her, the procedure took time and her mind was still a little fuzzy. The Rasengan was a technique created by the fourth Hokage. To this day, only he and Jiraiya, Lady Tsunade's old teammate, have ever mastered it. Naruto looked in the direction of the young woman, who answered him as she struck her hand in a handshake. I'm Jizune, Lady Tsunade's personal assistant. Naruto took the hand and shook it. I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Everyone missed Tsunade's raised an eyebrow at hearing the name, but she covered it well. I'm sorry, Naruto, but while Lady Tsunade is like this, I'm obligated to tell you that we currently do not have the funds to repay the money we lost. She looked worried at Tsunade, who looked about ready to take a nap, embarrassingly using her own ample bosoms as a makeshift pillow. May I ask what you were instructed to do? Should we not comply? Naruto nodded, and Gaara took over. We have explicit orders that should you be unable to repay the debt, or in the event you refuse, we are to escort you back to our client. Shizune once again looked sadly at her boss and mother figure before shaking her head. I'm sorry, but Lady Tsunade won't. She was interrupted as Tsunade's head suddenly came up, looking at the three getting in intently, especially Naruto. Shh, Sasune. She narrowed her eyes with a smirk. I have a proposition for the brat. Shizune looked extremely worried as she played with her hands. Lady Tsunade, I don't think that's a good idea. We can't. The old woman just looked at her young apprentice, very clearly telling her to be quiet, which she did so. You, the blonde one. Naruto. Naruto scowled at the drunken woman, but let her continue. How long have you got before you have to bring me back? Gara answered for him. We were given a month before we have to return to Sunagakure. We left 2 days ago. Tsunade nodded in an exaggerated manner, mulling over the numbers with difficulty as her drunken mind tried to grasp maths. Okay then, I'll give this little gaki 3 weeks to learn the Rasengan. She looked right at Naruto in a very smug manner. If you can do that, then I'll pay back the money. Sound fair? In fact, if you do it, I'll even throw in my necklace. Gara narrowed his eyes at the proposition. There was obviously some catch, but there was no way they could actually take on one of the Sanin, so they had no other choice. How do we know you won't run away with while Naruto is training? Tsunade smiled drunkenly with her other eyes closed, looking damn near to passing out. One of you brats can watch me if you like. Naruto, she looked thoughtful for a moment before surprising everyone at the table by grabbing her breast in both hands. But no funny business. And with another satisfied smile, she happily lay down on the boobs she had just grabbed and dozed off. Everyone just stared at her a moment with large drops of sweat hanging off her head before Tsunade smiled and began to hoist Tsunade up using her shoulder. Well, you might as well come and stay at our hotel room. The three Gani nodded, following the older woman carrying the even older woman out of the bar. Naruto stopped outside, slapping his head in annoyance as he remembered something. Wait, I still don't know what the hell is a Rasengan. Naruto lay on the ground, exhausted and spent. He brought his hand up into his face, turning it in the moonlight to see the extent of the damage to his training he'd done. He had chakra burns practically covering his hand. Kiri was doing her best to keep up with the damage with her own chakra, but that was the problem in the first place. While Shizune had explained the concept of the Rasengan, and Tsunade improved that description when she finally sobered up, knowing what something is and actually doing it were two different things. All they knew was that it had something to do with spinning the chakra, condensing it, and then holding it. Much easier said than done. Naruto pulled in a deep, painful breath and raised his hand, already channeling the chakra and spinning it. He looked at the rotating disc of chakra in his hand, shaking his head as he did so. He knew it was supposed to be a ball, but he didn't know how to manipulate the chakra into such a shape. He tried to visualize a sphere, going back to basics as it were, thinking of how it was made up. He guessed it was just a load of different rings at different angles, and thought he knew how he could use that. He took another deep breath and tried to will another disc into existence. This time spinning vertically. He just managed to do it, but at this point his hand was burning from the combined effort of the day. He looked at what he made in satisfaction. At least it now looked something like a sphere, and he could work from there. Naruto had his eyes screwed shut in concentration, focusing on the movement of chakra in his palm. A week had gone by since Tsunade issued the challenge, and he was proud to say he was making progress. After his initial breakthrough, he had quickly found that the more rotations he added to the sphere, the more difficulty it became to control. The extra burns on his hands were a testament to that. The ball of energy he was extremely yearning to expand, to grow, and eventually dissipate. It had gotten to the point where Naruto had simply allowed it. The ball doubled in size, but became nearly half as difficult to manage. He smiled. He now had a perfect sphere to rotate energy contained within his hands. He frowned, remembering that the Fukake had spent nearly 3 years perfecting this technique, so it couldn't possibly be this easy. The moment of truth came when he firmly planted the sphere of energy into a nearby tree, only for it to pathetically strip a few layers of bark before pattering out. He stared at his hand in dismay, wondering what it was he did wrong. He had the ball of chakra, and it was spinning in multiple directions, all at the same speed. He thought that maybe he just needed more power behind it, and set about infusing his Rasengan with more chakra to see what would happen. The trees around him were wrecked, many emblazed with a swirling burn pattern like some kind of brand. He grunted in frustration before summoning yet another ball, pouring in as much chakra as he thought was safe without letting it expand anymore. He was sweating from the exertion it put him under, not just today, but from going at this non-stop for nearly 5 days. He only had a little over a week until the deadline, and he had to make these days count. He couldn't let down his friends or the client. More importantly, he couldn't let down Tsunade. He had seen it in her eyes. She had lost something very precious that was slowly eating away at her. She hid the pain with gambling and drinking, but there was no hiding the fact that she had simply given up hope. She didn't expect him to do this. She didn't expect him to succeed, so he needed to prove her wrong. He needed to show her that things were possible, and you couldn't just give up on the world. He growled in frustration and gripped his wrist, now pouring his chakra from both arms, making the ball pulse incessantly. He didn't care anymore. He wasn't going to limit it. He simply poured in as much chakra as he could, controlling it as best he could from the outside. Finally, with a satisfactory cry, he held out a very condensed spinning ball of chakra, doubling the size of his palm. With a roar, he slammed it into a tree, only for his concentration to slip at the last moment. The explosion could be heard throughout the entire town. The explosion had taken him out for a few days. There were only 3 days until the deadline, but it was the best thing to have happened so far. Firstly, he had seen that he could in fact do it. It was possible, and that was all the motivation he needed. Secondly, he had time to think about what else needed to be done, and had finally come up with an answer. He wasn't completely sure it would work, but that was what he was out here to find out. He formed a Rasengan as quickly as possible, clutching his wrist to steady and increase the chakra supply. Next, he condensed it, molding it down while pumping in more chakra before it glowed and pulsed happily. Finally, before he lost control again, he attempted to form a thin membrane of chakra around the sphere to contain its energies. He laughed triumphantly as he felt his control over the sphere increase dramatically. He couldn't help it. He just laughed. People passing would have thought him insane for laughing manically while holding a bright ball of energy. All his hard work and perseverance finally paid off as he held up the sphere, proudly looking at it. He had to hold his wrist to do it, but at least he managed it. He could work on improving it later. Right now, he had a bet to win. With that, he drove the ball into a tree, cleanly shearing the trunk straight through before he cheerfully sprinted back to town. Tsunade stared at the shining ball with a look caught between disbelief, annoyance, confusion, and a small amount of pride. Naruto, for his part, just looked extremely pleased, not smug, but pleased nevertheless. Shizune was equally shocked. While neither of them had actually expected the boy to accomplish the feat, she was now more worried about the consequences. They would have to pull out another loan to pay off the Suna debt. After all, Tsunade may have run out on debts, but she always kept her side of deals. On that same line of thought, the old woman smiled softly as Naruto dissipated the ball of energy, reaching around her neck to unclasp the necklace that hung there. Naruto watched her strangely, only now remembering that part of the deal. He wondered what the significance of the necklace was. It looked old and valuable. However, when Tsunade handed it over, he felt calmed by its presence. He also thought it looked pretty cool as he threw it on, letting the cold crystal fall on his chest. That was my grandfather's, the Sandame's Hokage. And Naruto looked up at Tsunade, who was smiling sadly at the aquarium crystal. Immediately, Naruto felt regretful for separating the woman for something that obviously held great sentimental and monetary value. However, when he moved to remove it and give it back, Tsunade stopped him, making sure his hand was firmly clasped around the amulet. "No, Naruto, you earned this." Her smile lost its sad edge, and she leaned closer, catching Naruto by surprise, and moved his headband to one side and gently kissed his forehead. "I didn't think you would be able to do it." Her smile had grown at Naruto's flushed face as she leaned back. "Thank you for proving me wrong." They talked a little bit longer, but ultimately their mission had been fulfilled, and Tsunade went about making the necessary preparations to pay the money she had lost. She sighed inwardly happy for Naruto's success, but at the same time greatly irritated by it. No doubt she was going to have to change her appearance yet again to escape bankruptcy. To think she had gotten used to her 30 years old form, she sighed, thinking that maybe her teens might be fun again. She idly rubbed the spot her necklace had once rested. A frown appeared as she thought back to its previous two owners, but dispelled those thoughts when she looked across at Naruto, happily chatting with his friends and Shizune. You learned the Rasengan in 3 weeks? Naruto nodded happily, frowning afterwards at the implications in Jiraiya's tone of voice. So, Jiraiya mumbled something under his breath about annoying blondes. He looked down at his palm and remembered the 4 months that it took him. Then again, he didn't have to grab his wrist to make a perfect Rasengan. However, it didn't escape him notice that Naruto's was larger, closer to the size of Minato's. Sadly, he pulled out the same assortment of balloons from his pocket, throwing them uselessly into the trash. He spent that entire time coming up with a way to learn the technique easily, and Naruto had gone and done it anyway. Even through his disappointment though, Jiraiya couldn't help but smile. The boy really was Minato's son. He laughed softly to himself. Next, the boy was going to tell him he had mastered the Hiraishin, building the special kunai from scratch. He laughed again at the absurdity before suddenly looking at the blonde with an intent-filled gaze. Naruto sweated under the observation before Jiraiya finally let up, shaking his head and mumbling, "Nah, it couldn't be," under his breath. The old man seemed to notice that everybody was staring at him like he was insane, and he coughed loudly. Alright then, if there's nothing else, then I guess we all better hit the hay." A devious smirk lit up his face. "I only got 2 rooms, so I guess me and Uncle will bunk up." He said it with a lewd grin that immediately told them he was lost to his little pervert fantasy world. "Yeah, as if, you pervert. I'd rather bunk with the gakis than you." Jiraiya's face fell before he walked off, mumbling ever more incoherent things. Everyone retired to the rooms that Jiraiya had bought and dumped their equipment down on the floor. That left everyone in the awkward position of staring at the 2 beds before Gaara wordlessly walked over and sat on one, crossing his arms and daring anybody to disagree with him with his eyes. The other 3 stared at the last bed before they all ran to it, shoving and pushing as they dived onto the mattress, still somewhat wrestling for control of the bed. Needless to say, Naruto had a very awkward night as he laid in bed, Tagiya to one side and Anko to the other. He didn't know what Anko was dreaming about, but he imagined it had something to do with teddy bears, considering the way she was clutching him to her. He didn't dare move or wake her though. There was a kunai right beneath her pillow, and he didn't quite fancy testing her reflexes. Naruto didn't get much sleep that night. End of chapter 24.